This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast Ellen E. Jones, who has just won a prestigious prize for her wonderful book Screen Deep: How Cinema and Popular Culture Can Change the World. Can solve racism and change the world.
How film and TV can solve racism and save the world. Yeah, it's a very grand subtitle, so I've memorized it now. It took me a while though.
I know, I've got a book out at the moment and I can't remember the title of my own book. I keep calling it Visible Darkness and it should be called Darkness Visible. So that's my own fault for using a Miltonic inversion in my title. So first off, I wanted to ask you this prize, about this prize that you've won, because you're the second time we've had a winner on the podcast, and there's scant encouragement for writers out there. So I think anything that can help a writer is a good thing. So I'd really love to publicize the prize and, of course, your book. And the recognition you've been given.
Yeah, so it's from the Kraszna-Krausz Foundation, and they're this incredible organisation, and every year they award a prize to a book about moving image, so cinema and television, which is the one that my book's won, Screen Deep, and also a book about photography. And it's just such a wonderful way of highlighting. So they long list about 10 books and then they narrow it down to 3, I think, and then the final book that's given the award. And all of the books are excellent. In the long list, and they do like a sort of exhibition at their foundation of various galleries with the books that are on display, and people can come and have a look at all the books that have been nominated, which, as I say, are all well worth having a look at. And it's just a really good kind of temperature take on what's going on in conversations around cinema and television and photography in the world, really. And there's always a real kind of variety in the kinds of books that are there. So I'm really proud to have won it, and we're doing this event where at the Barbican next week, where I'm going to be talking about my book and a film that's really important to me and is important in the book, called Imitation of Life, from 1959. It's Douglas Sirk melodrama, fantastic film with Lana Turner and Juanita Moore, and loads of other interesting actors. And it's one of those films that has loads of kind of fascinating tangents coming off of it, all of which not all of which, but many of which tie back to my central theme of Screen Deep, which is how film and TV have been used in the construction of racial identities and also in racism itself, and how because of that they might in the future be used to dismantle racist ideas. And that's kind of my sort of exciting theory that I'm interested in unpicking, and that I think Imitation of Life is going to be a fun one to use to look at that a bit more.
So this podcast is going to go out on Wednesday this week, so we're talking on the Monday. People who are listening to this will have and are around London will have the opportunity to attend.
Brilliant. Yeah, I hope they do. I'm going to be I'm going to give a little intro to the film first, because there's lots of sort of details about it that I want people to be looking out for that can kind of enrich your viewing of it. I think with people there who've seen it before, I mean, I first saw it on telly as a kid, but I also think that it's one of those films that's got enough richness and sort of layer upon layer of irony, as a lot of Douglas Sirk's work does. You can find new stuff in it to be engaged with and fascinated with. And then after the film itself, I'm going to be in conversation with Rhianna Dillon, who's a brilliant film critic, a Radio 1 film critic and elsewhere as well, and just talking about these themes in the book about race and gender and class and Lana Turner's love life and Richard Pryor's knife fights from the late 50s and all sorts of other stuff which might not immediately seem connected, but I promise you is.
I've been reading about Lana Turner recently because of her sort of affair with Johnny Stompanato, and
yes,
there's a whole story there where her daughter killed a gangster, and Sean Connery was in trouble, and lots of things going on.
Do you want to talk about that now? I've got loads to say about that. Yeah, but I mean, this film was just made at a kind of fascinating point in Lana Turner's career, but also in Douglas Sirk, the director's career, and in American history generally. So it's this real sort of nexus with loads of different stuff going on, and it speaks to all of them in a really interesting way. So it was the final film that Douglas Sirk made before moving back to Germany. He was a German guy who'd come over in 1937 because he himself was a socialist who was married to a Jewish woman who was being persecuted by the Nazis. But his son from his first relationship was fighting for the German army. So he was in this kind of torture position, which is almost like something out of one of his melodramas. Came over to America, became this hugely successful, although not very critically well regarded in his period, director of melodramas, I would say, to put it bluntly, because of the sexism and racism of the time, that these films about women were not of interest to kind of the high-minded critical establishment. And then I think this is his masterpiece, Imitation of Life, that he made in 1959. And then it was in Lana Turner's life, she was already a huge star. You know, famously, she was the sweater girl and had that kind of total Hollywood lore story of being, you know, picked as a movie star from being at a soda stand and just looking gorgeous. But she was sort of on her fourth husband, I think, at this point, and she had 1958, so the year before the film came out, was in this particularly abusive relationship with the mobster Johnny Stompanato. He was essentially beating her up. Her 14-year-old daughter came in, and in an act of, I think, heroism, really, self-defense, saving, I believe, not only her own life, but her mother's life and her grandmother's life, all of whom had been threatened by Johnny Stompanato, stabbed him. He died. She went on trial for that. It was eventually, I mean, this story, again, it's like, all of it is something out of melodrama. But it was ruled a lawful killing. But obviously, that's still a hugely traumatic event to happen in a 14-year-old's life, so with a single mother, and for Lana Turner as well. And so the very next film Lana Turner makes is this film about a woman with a tortured relationship with her teenage daughter and another paralleled mother-daughter relationship. And it's a huge success for her. She made loads of money. I think it was probably one of the most successful films of her career. So there's loads of kind of layers and layers of meta meaning in there for anyone who's interested in that sort of thing. And I don't know how you could not be interested, really.
It's interesting as well. You talked just then about how critically Douglas Sirk wasn't well regarded by the more intellectual sort of branch, but how he had an audience, had a huge audience, and how you're looking at a movie which, you know, some would sort of dismiss or at the time as being, you know, oh, this is just melodrama, this is a so-called women's film, you know, which was a genre I guess you would compare to sort of chick flicks and chick lit, and that way of demeaning anything that talks about women and dismisses anything that talks about women, and so it's almost it's not really so much a hiding place for more subversive ideas, because the whole thing is about those ideas. So it's sort of like it's not really the subtext, it's the text of the thing.
Yeah, I think that that's more subtextual and has had to kind of be drawn out over the years is probably the racial dimension,
right,
or the intersectional feminist dimension to the kind of the gender discussion there. Like Imitation of Life is a really interesting text. It's originally a 1933 novel by a woman called Fanny Hurst, a Jewish woman who was good mates with Zora Neale Hurston, the, you know, towering figure of the Harlem Renaissance black writer. And she wrote this novel, which is about the phenomenon of passing, a sort of, I think to us in 21st century Europe and the UK, quite a strange idea to get our heads around, but basically is dependent on this one drop rule idea in you know, slavery and post-slavery America, where any amount of African genetic heritage means you are defined as black and therefore subject to slavery or to enslavement, or to, in you know, in after slavery, to oppression and, you know, all the other, you know, racist subjugation in society. But because of the way race actually works, because of the fact that it's actually kind of a social construct and porous, and the fact that you could if that's the case genetically, then you could have blonde hair and blue eyes and still be considered quote unquote Negro, to use the racial terminology of the time. It meant that there was this possibility for people who looked white but were considered black, and all of these terms are in inverted commas, to pass, that is to abandon their family of origin and their country place of origin, where they would, if they stayed, be forever condemned to a sort of second, third, fourth class citizen lifestyle and to not have the opportunities that white people had, and then move into a place where their origins were unknown and live the life of a white person with all the opportunities, basically to live the life of a full human being, entitled to the opportunities of, you know, human rights as prescribed by the philosophers of the Enlightenment, basically. So, I mean, what a choice. No wonder it's the subject of quite a few mid-century dramas and 20th century American fiction, and it is the subject of that Fannie Hurst book. But then it kind of gets made into a melodrama in 1937, maybe, I have to look up, a John M. Stahl film with Claudette Colbert, my grandmother's favourite actress, in the lead role, the role that would later be played by Lana Turner. And then it gets remade again by Douglas Sirk in 1959, a period during which civil rights is much more on the agenda. The sort of ideas about what racial progression is, what a good Negro is, again in quotes, what kind of black people should be entitled to, have progressed somewhat, but also not in other ways. Sorry, my cat's being annoying. Let me just...
No worries at all. We're cat friendly.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That's good to be on a cat friendly podcast. The only kind I would ever, entertain. There's lots of kind of conversation about, like, interestingly, when the book came out, Zora Neale Hurston said she was a fan of it, and Langston Hughes did too, another figure from the Harlem Renaissance. And then there was this really kind of scathing review of it, which I think utterly stands up to scrutiny today. Like, it's just really on point and incisive. I've forgotten the name of the guy that wrote it, unfortunately, but it'll come to me, which basically points out all the kind of mammy stereotypes in it. So the lead white, it's about a single white mother who, in all the adaptations, is down on her luck and then meets a black woman who becomes her maid, who also has a daughter, and the black woman's daughter is light-skinned and is interested in passing as they go on. So in the book version, it was initially regarded as kind of a positive thing that there's this relationship with the black character, but kind of later on he pointed out, this critic, that the sort of mammy undertones and the kind of the sort of ways in which white women are being liberated and black women are being exploited in order to further white women's liberation. Right. And that's a kind of dynamic that continues in the Sirk film, but in slightly less egregious ways. Although I would argue that, like, so for instance, in the book and the Stahl adaptation, the white woman makes her money by taking a recipe for either pancakes or waffles that her maid has and then turning it into a huge business. And she might, in various versions, offer the maid some of the money from that, but the maid, in a saintly, self-sacrificing fashion, declines, because all of her desire and want and ambition is to work for this white woman. That's all she wants in the world, which is classic mammy territory and not a type that actually exists and is a racist stereotype. In the film, in the Douglas Sirk version, Lana Turner's character Laura makes her money as a Broadway actress, which is, i.e., off her own steam. It's not entirely off her own steam, because she wouldn't be able to do it if she didn't have this black woman looking after her kids and her home for her, and the way that a sort of a wife would do for a man in that period. But it's at least not quite as openly exploitative, financially exploitative as the early relationship. And also it allows Lana Turner to wear all these incredible costumes and jewelry and is part of the pleasure of watching the film.
It reminds me a little bit as well of a 2021 film, Passing, Rebecca Hall directed, with Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga. And one thing I only very recently discovered this film. It's been on my watch list for ages, and I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really interesting look and a really good sort of shifting of perspectives as well, because you see it very much from a black perspective rather than a white perspective, and it's very much steeped in a black middle class that you never see on screen. That period, you always see you always see it from the white perspective, and you very rarely see it from the black perspective, and the fact that the black society has its own divisions within itself in terms of class. And one of the things I remember sort of Googling after I watched it was, why is Rebecca Hall making this film? Because she's, why is this film being made, written, directed by it's adapted from a novel, but by this, white woman. And then I read it into Rebecca Hall's history, and she has a mixed race mother, and therefore under the thing that you've just been talking about, that one drop of blood sort of racist sort of ideology,
one drop rule,
one drop rule, it would be she would be considered to be passing now, and that's and so it doesn't, hopefully,
not necessarily passing. She'd be considered to be, if we were in the Deep South in antebellum period or Jim Crow era, she would be considered to be a Negro. Yes. And if she was passing herself off as white, she would be considered to be passing.
Right. So
passing is not simply having a white appearance. It's also it's denying your black identity, which society decides that you must adopt.
Yeah, it's
just important, because the notion of passing is sometimes used as a kind of derogatory way of talking about the people themselves, when obviously the people themselves are acting in whatever way they have to because of the boundaries that have been prescribed by society. And that's where the kind of there's another cinematic trope, actually, racist trope, of the kind of the tragic mulatto, or the kind of sexually seductive mixed race woman who is deceitful, because within the sort of one drop rule of the racial kind of politics of the time, your very identity as a mixed race person is deceitful, because you are blurring these supposedly firm boundaries between white and black, when the whole of whiteness is a construction in order to maintain power over enslaved Africans and their descendants. So it's just important to be distinct about what passing is and what people just their being themselves is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The context is everything, and you can't blame people for their choices when you don't understand.
And also the historical context is fascinating, because I would argue that now, and I think probably, and I interviewed Rebecca Hall when Passing came out, and we spoke about this, because I consider myself to be a sort of racially ambiguous person as well, and so I was really fascinated by Passing. I thought it was a brilliant film. The book's really interesting, and how she'd adapt it. But I think it's important also to note that historical context changes. So Rebecca Hall now, I think, is probably and would consider herself to be white. Now, she might, in most contexts, would be received as a white person. She might describe herself as mixed race also, because that is a racial identity that's available to her in 21st century UK, less so in America, actually, where people talk about biracial and still talk, and the legacy of the one drop rule continues in people sort of forcing a more kind of distinct classification of people's racial identities. But because that idea of blackness as being a kind of hereditary one drop rule thing doesn't exist anymore in the same way as it did then. So, but what I'm saying is our identities are historically dependent and socially dependent on the context of the times as well. So that's why one of the reasons why Passing is such an interesting film and such a clever film is because it actually uses the medium of film to reveal to us how porous and flexible racial identity is. And what I mean by that is because it's black and white in a kind of powerful contrast to the Eastman colour of Cirque's film about passing, Imitation of Life. The black and white tone of the film kind of flattens the tone of their skin colour. So you've got two actresses, Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga, who in person have about roughly the same skin tone, I'd say. I've met them both in same colouring. They're both what I would describe as, or I would say, I think actually I'm not sure about Tessa Thompson. She might have two black parents, but Ruth Negga is mixed race. And in the film, Ruth Negga is the character who's passing and has bleached blonde hair. Sometimes she does. You could see how she would pass for white because of the flattening of the film tone. But also, it's only the flattening of the film tone that's kind of it. If you see them in a colour film together, these are obviously two mixed race women or light-skinned black. So I think as I was saying that when I was initially describing my book, I think Passing is a really great example of how the same tools of cinema that have been used to kind of construct these firm, unbendable, oppressive racial identities are now kind of being used to liberate us in a way by revealing to us how actually flexible and porous and nonsensical and contextual these identities are.
Yeah, I'm thinking as well, you were talking about that other stereotype of the mixed race sort of seductress. We're using a lot of quotation marks here. I hope everyone understands this is a good faith conversation. So, but that popped up earlier this year in Sinners, I thought, with the
big time.
And of course in Sinners you've got
Ellie Stanfield's role,
exactly, and you've got a really interesting sort of mixture of the Irish as well, being sort of another sort of impoverished, oppressed group turning up as the sort of villains of the piece. Villains again. I mean, the thing is, these societies are not static; they're always changing. In Passing, Tessa Thompson's character is at the heart of trying to change the society. And so the whole point is we're not just going to submit and suffer from society. We're going to try to change it so that our children won't, and we're looking at it retrospectively and saying, oof, you've got another 60, 70 years before that changes, or yes, you are part of a tradition of change which is ongoing,
Yeah, and yet this is why it's such a subtle and complex and good film and a good story. She is part of Tessa Thompson's character is part of this kind of like black upper class, but she also has internalized racist attitudes. And what I mean by this is that she has a dark-skinned maid working for her, who she's got a kind of fraught relationship with, and there's this sort of colorist idea that the darker your skin, the more working class you are, and that having lighter skin, even within the black community, is more kind of elite and upper class. And she isn't really interrogating that. And I think that kind of colorism is something that you see, well, certainly right up to today, but like you see in, people now talk about in retrospect, and this is something that's happening in cinema as well, which is, I'm sorry to finish my sentence, people now talk about in retrospect, or are able to critique the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, and how in some ways that was, obviously it should be said it achieved a huge amount and was full of heroes, but it's good to be at a place where we can kind of critique that. So one of the things that people talk about, for instance, is that Rosa Parks is the face of the bus boycott. But there was another woman, I think her name, I can't remember her name, which is kind of proving the point in itself. I think it's Claudette Colvin or something like that, but I'd have to look it up, so maybe cut that out. And who was darker skinned, who was a teenage mom, and who basically had been doing that. This had been staying.
It is Claudette Colvin. It is. So we.
Oh, great.
So we don't have to cut it out.
These things exist in the back of my brain somewhere. Yeah. That's good. Claudette Colvin had been sitting in her seat at the back of the bus and doing the thing that Rosa Parks became famous for. But basically, the civil rights movement, the powers that be, mostly men, decided that she would not be a good face of the movement because she was darker skinned, more working class. I think possibly had a kid out of wedlock, whereas Rosa Parks was a bit more of a sort of upstanding character and lighter skinned, and made a better, not without reason did they make these assumptions, because these are all bigotries and prejudices that certainly existed in the society at the time and possibly continue to exist today, and it does play into how the media receives you. So but I think just the acknowledgement that these kinds of lack of intersectionality, colorist attitudes, sexist attitudes can exist even within these movements of liberation is something that cinema is able to do now. I'm thinking specifically of Till, Chinonye Chukwu's film from, might be 2021, a couple of years ago, around the same time as Passing, which is an incredible film, and it kind of focuses on May Mobley Till, Emmett Till's mother, and how vital and how incredible it was that she was able to have the wherewithal and the foresight to, even in that moment of huge tragedy when her child had been taken from her, to be able to turn that grief and that tragedy into a moment of progression for the liberation of Black Americans everywhere. And she would, that decision about allowing his open casket to be on the cover of Life magazine, and which was hugely influential in the movement. But how she was also, as a woman, sidelined by the sort of men within the civil rights movement. And the film kind of, with a Black female director, is like exploring that, 50 years on, so 70 years on. So yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting films out at the moment that are kind of continuing on the journey that films like Imitation of Life were just sort of starting out on in the 1950s at the time.
I'd like to add maybe another example, which I saw last night, and I think it leads into your point about the different color grades of the black and white and the flattening aspect of that, in terms of like sort of the methodology of film or the technology of film can advance certain ideas. The Perfect Neighbor that has just came out in Sundance and has just been released on Netflix is a film that's made almost entirely of police body cam footage. And we're more used to thinking of police body cam footage as being something, well, it is something that has revealed racism and has revealed, but also the cameras are often turned off when that racism is happening, and it's actually bystanders that are filming moments, a teenage girl filming the death which created the Black Lives Matter movement, and and unfortunately several others. But The Perfect Neighbor uses that footage and uses police interventions and also inadequacies to tell a story of a sort of tragic but at the same time structural racism in Florida, in a case which I kind of don't want to spoil it, even though it's real life, because I think it's best experienced through the film itself. But it's just interesting how this technology, which, as I say, we usually think of as sort of oppressive, is actually being used to tell a story which is much more empathetic and finally politically allows you to see something a bit raw and real and how it can escalate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't seen that film yet, but I've heard about it, and I think like it particularly speaks to the Black Lives Matter moment, or after. So the Black Lives Matter movement began long before George Floyd's murder in 2020.
Of course, yeah.
When that happened, a lot of us were in lockdown. So there was this particular kind of intensity about the way people were seeing these, what you're talking about, sometimes police body cam footage, often someone's mobile phone footage of an incident of police brutality resulting in an unarmed Black person's death. Over and over again, they'd be in your kind of social media stream one after another. And that kind of interaction with the screen and the moving image was like a totally new way of race and racial identity and racism coming at us through a screen, and a really intense way as well. And so I think cinema has kind of been struggling to respond to that with a sort of equal level of intensity since. And maybe what Perfect Neighbor is doing, I'm really looking forward to seeing it now, is kind of working out a language for that now, which is really interesting. Yeah,
you have to write to me and tell me what you think of it, because it's I think it fits into your argument, but you might see something I don't, and you certainly will have other views as well. Well, this leads on to what I wanted to talk about next as well, because as well as having, the prize that you've got is about books on things which are to do with the images in the moving screen, moving images on screens. And I would say of the last 2 years, the real thing that we've seen is essentially a genocide unfold on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or wherever you get your reels or your mini videos. And this has also started to this has had an impact which I feel has been, I've lived through genocide in the sense that Rwanda genocide happened when I was cognizant and an adult. So, but it happened, and you saw the aftermath of it, and it was very much framed as a BBC News report in the way, say, the famine in Ethiopia was in the 1980s. But here we've got we've got an absence of journalism. There's no journalists on the ground actually reporting things. And no, that's not true, sorry. There's no BBC journalists on the ground reporting things. There are Palestinian journalists reporting things frequently at the cost of their lives. It connects to the subtitle of your book, essentially, this idea that we're dealing with this situation unfolding in front of us. And screens can have sort of a twofold, they connect us to the world, but they also protect us from the world. They're an intermediary, an interface, but they're also something which blocks. And I don't know, I'm as confused as a lot of people, but at the same time, I have massive emotional responses to this material.
I think one of the things I'd like to talk about in the way that this relates to my book is a conversation I had with a Indigenous American or First Nations Canadian film critic called Jesse Wente for my book about the depiction of Indigenous Americans on screen, throughout the Western. In fact, from the very beginning of cinema, when Edison is making his Ghost Dance film, Indigenous Americans are some of the first subjects of cinema, like from the very, very earliest moving images. There are white men making films about Indigenous Americans and kind of through their own lens deciding what Indigenous American culture is and sort of shaping it. And then, the Ghost Dance film is particularly symbolic in a way because just a few years before then, Indigenous American people had been massacred for doing the Ghost Dance, which was like a sort of forbidden, it was essentially a forbidden form of expression of grief over having their land stolen from them and being massacred, throughout the kind of history of America. And so for them that to be the subject of a film which they were, making no money from, and it being kind of directed by a white man is kind of ironic and in a horrible way. The point is, what Jesse Wente talks about, and he's written about this extensively, is the way in which cinema can contribute to a kind of drip dehumanizing of a particular racial group, and how this is significant, not just because it's in poor taste or an incomplete picture of the world, but because it has direct consequences in that if we gradually come to believe that one group is less human, we can subject them to all kinds of violence and essentially ultimately to genocide if we don't believe that they have the same rights as another group. And cinema has also been engaged in a kind of dehumanizing campaign against Arab people. Palestinian people have been essentially erased from cinema culture. Like it remains even increasingly so in the last 2 years difficult for Palestinian films to, we've seen No Other Land getting an Oscar nomination and still struggling. The Hind right, I've forgotten
the voice of Hind Rajab.
The voice of Hind Rajab is still struggling to find any kind of distribution. So these films by Palestinian filmmakers are still discriminated against in terms of their exhibition and distribution for obvious political reasons. And but before that, in mainstream Hollywood product, you've got this kind of idea that like an Arab person is necessarily a terrorist threat, is always like the kind of a burqa is always hiding a bomb. Or like I'm thinking about like stuff like The Bodyguard, like this sort of Jed Mercurio's very popular TV show, which has spoilers, but it was on TV many moons ago. So sorry, but like the sort of twist of which is that it's the Muslim woman hiding the bomb under the hijab, which is always kind of a sort of TV trope of itself now. Or like William Friedkin made this film in 2000, and it's a kind of. So the name escapes me.
Samuel L. Jackson.
Yeah, the Samuel L. Jackson.
Rules of Engagement, it's called.
Thank you. So William Friedkin's Rules of Engagement is like this courtroom drama, the twist of which is that he was right to just massacre a whole bunch of Arab children, because guess what? The child was a terrorist. The 6-year-old child was hiding a gun, absurdly.
It's an absolute repugnant film. I'm a fan of Friedkin. Well, some of Friedkin's films, but I would say there's a scene in that film where it's sort of like a flashback to, you see what actually happened, and it is as racist as the sort of scene of black people eating legs in Birth of a Nation. It's just absolutely horrible.
Or to bring it back to our original point, to like stagecoach this idea that Indigenous Americans were the ones committing all the massacres, when the historical record and the bodies still buried under the grounds of the White House prove otherwise. So cinema is often on. I mean, it is often in about the business of constructing nations, of giving specifically the nation of America often like this kind of legitimacy that it doesn't otherwise have, and it does that by dehumanizing and by dismissing the human rights of the people who were living there already, whether we're talking about Palestine or America or any other colonialized land.
It's been it's been rough, and there's no it's been one of those arguments that I feel like I've lost friends over, or I've not lost friends over really. There's no one who's been so on the wrong side of this, but I feel there's a real potential to lose friends over. There are some certain people I've sort of like, I'm not going to push this because I don't see any happy ending to this, Yeah.
Miriam Margolyes, who's someone I admire hugely, was talking very movingly about that, as a Jewish woman,
right,
a left-wing Jewish woman who cares about and stands up for and is vocal about the rights of Palestinians, that she has lost very close relationships to friends. And I have a lot of sympathy for Jewish people in that position, because it's horrendous. But also the truth is just the truth.
Yeah, exactly. I'm certainly don't feel like I need to soften my opinion of it until there is evidence otherwise, because the evidence is all pointing in one direction at the moment. Yeah, I mean, it's horrific, and the reaction of cinema. I had the opportunity of seeing The Voice of Hind Rajab in Venice, and I was at the press screening, which was massive. I've never seen a press screening have such a reaction in that way. It was really moving. So let's hope they get distribution very soon. Okay, I know we have a limited amount of time today, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to the original conversation we had about your book is going to come after this conversation, but I'd also like to ask you, if you've been reading any film books that you would like to recommend to our listeners.
I've just read, which I did really enjoy, I have to say. Michael J. Fox has got another installment of his many memoirs.
It's the status quo of autobiographic writers.
Yeah. It's called Future Boy. And he's got no right to still be managing to find ways to make his career interesting. But I do think he has got a uniquely interesting career. And so it's specifically about this period of time, I think it's about 3 months in 1985, when he was both making a full series of Family Ties and filming Back to the Future, the first Back to the Future film. So essentially he was having to work like 20-hour days, which is insane.
Right.
And it's quite a kind of detailed account of how he managed to pull that off without
speed and cocaine, surely.
Never get mentioned. That's the one big omission, I will say that. But it's also it kind of in telling that story gets the heart of what I think is one of the most fascinating and glorious mysteries of 20th century American cinema, which is how this short working class Canadian became such a huge movie star. And the answer is bucket loads of charisma and really hard work. But like he's so I just find him very charming, and it's quite a slim volume, and it's sort of surprising how worthwhile it manages to be, despite the fact that this is the 5th installment of his memoirs. But good for him. I'm a fan. I love Back to the Future as well. There's lots of nice detail, and even if you are a massive Back to the Future fan like me, there's lots of kind of nice sort of surprising stuff in there. So that's my recommendation.
There's a book to be written on Canadians in Hollywood, because there's so many of them. Keanu Reeves, William Shatner.
Actually, a lot of to sort of bring it back to what we were talking about, a lot of the actors who play Indigenous Americans are actually First Nations Canadians, because they've got the short reason for why that is because they've got a much kind of stronger theatre scene there. So a lot of the actors, the sort of very trained actors, will come down to America and be passing themselves off as like different kinds of Sioux Indians or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd presume as well there'd be, the difference between the demarcation of Canada and United States wouldn't necessarily have mattered.
It's all Turtle Island as far as I'm concerned. And also it's better than a Sicilian playing
or Burt Lancaster,
American, which was for a long time, or a Jewish guy, which was for a long time the way they did it. Speaking to you, Ionized Cody, may you rest in peace and power.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for joining me. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you again.
You too.
And congratulations on the prize.
Thank you very much.